When I received this invitation, I didn't really read the email. I thought it said low FODMAP and a gluten-free diet in IBS. And only when I started putting this together a few weeks ago, it said IBD, and I thought, oh, bugger. I don't think there's much data out there, so actually you could probably all leave and you probably won't. Anyway, I managed to rustle a few slides together, and hopefully, in all honesty, I've actually learned a fair bit doing this, putting this talk together. So what we have, so what is inflammatory bowel disease? I know this is Coeliac UK, and many of you will have come across IBD in the past, but just to go through this, here we have a very pristine looking colon, and this is ulcerative colitis. As you can see, quite heavily inflamed, and ulcerative colitis affects around 0.2% of the population. We also have Crohn's disease, which again is an inflammation of the bowel, and this affects around 0.1% of the population. So you can imagine these are quite severe diseases, and they can lead to quite debilitating symptoms. Now, another thing I need to confess, Matt, sorry I stole your slide without asking you. But what are the causes of IBD? Well, there is no unifying cause. There's a variety of potential hypotheses that are being put together. For example, you can have this genetics, microbes, environmental, and also diet. And for the purpose of this talk, we'll focus on the dietary role in IBD. So what do we know about diet in IBD? Well, firstly, there are some studies that looked at risk factors for developing IBD. For example, if you have a diet high in animal fat or a diet low in fruit and veg, that can increase your predisposition to developing inflammatory bowel disease. Once a patient has inflammatory bowel disease and they have a severe flare, one form of treatment in children to try and avoid steroids would be enteral therapy. And that's been shown to reduce inflammation and dysbiosis, so that's a useful form of treatment. Finally, if you have ongoing IBD and you're looking at ways to control it, up to 2/3 of patients self-report that food can trigger their symptoms. And some of the most commonly reported foods are vegetables, fruit, milk and bread. And this nicely leads on to the role of gluten and FODMAPs, given the recent interest in this field. So we'll now discuss a gluten-free diet. So the first thing to ask is there a relationship between inflammatory bowel disease and celiac disease? Well, firstly, we know that there's a relationship between celiac disease and microscopic colitis. If you have celiac disease, you have a 10% risk of having microscopic colitis. But I would argue that microscopic colitis generally is not considered as the inflammatory bowel disease that I'm interested in, which is Crohn's disease or ulcerative colitis. So if you focus on those two, ulcerative colitis and Crohn's disease, is there an association there? So if we take patients with celiac disease, we found that they do not really have a greater risk of having inflammatory bowel disease than the healthy controls. So we looked at this in Sheffield. We found that patients with celiac disease, the risk of having inflammatory bowel disease was 1.6%. The risk of a healthy control having IBD was 0.8%. So no real difference there. Similarly, if you look at patients with inflammatory bowel disease, they do not have a greater risk of having celiac disease. So again, we've done this in Sheffield. In our IBD cohort, their risk of having celiac disease is 0.8%. In healthy controls, the risk of having celiac disease is 0.8%, so very similar. And similarly, there's a large Italian multi-center study which found that the risk of celiac disease in IBD is small. So there's no real association between inflammatory bowel disease or celiac disease. So therefore, you'd expect, well, there's no reason for IBD patients to be taking a gluten-free diet. However, this was a recent study published by the United States. So they did a cross-sectional internet-based observational study where they interviewed over 1,500 subjects with inflammatory bowel disease. And what's interesting is that very few had celiac disease, only 0.6%. Yet, 19% had previously tried a gluten-free diet. 8% were currently using a gluten-free diet. And what these individuals also said is that they reported a symptom improvement when they were following a gluten-free diet, and they had fewer or less severe flares on a gluten-free diet. So IBD patients, although they do not have celiac disease, are taking a gluten-free diet, and it makes them feel better. So what symptoms do they report improving? Well, there's an improvement in bloating, improvement in diarrhea, and improvement in abdominal pain, and some improvement in nausea and fatigue. We also did a study around the same time in secondary care where we looked at our IBD patients. We looked at 140 IBD patients, around 70 were Crohn's disease, around 70 were ulcerative colitis. None of these individuals had celiac disease, yet 28% of these subjects self-reported non-celiac gluten sensitivity, and up to 6% were taking a gluten-free diet. What we also noticed is that these individuals with IBD who self-reported non-celiac gluten sensitivity had more severe IBD or stricturing type of inflammatory bowel disease. So what we found is that, I think from the two studies, we've noticed that patients with inflammatory bowel disease are more likely to be taking a gluten-free diet, but these are simply observational studies, and I think that's very important. These are not randomized controlled trials, so you could argue this is all placebo. If this was a genuine association, well, we don't know the direction of causality. Is it IBD giving rise to self-reported non-celiac gluten sensitivity, or is it some form of gluten sensitivity giving rise to an immune reaction which is causing IBD? So there's lots of questions still to be answered. If we now focus on FODMAPs, which Nick's already touched on, there's not much data out here either. This is a study by the King's College group which looked at patients with inflammatory bowel disease whose IBD was generally well controlled, but they had ongoing functional gut symptoms, and they were advised to follow a low FODMAP diet. And what the group found is that when they had 72 patients with IBD going on to a low FODMAP diet, they 50% had an improvement in their abdominal symptoms, pain, bloating, wind and diarrhea. And this was across both Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis. So you can see there was an improvement in abdominal pain, diarrhea, bloating, and again abdominal pain, diarrhea and bloating. So patients with IBD going on a low FODMAP diet do feel that it is of some benefit. But this was a retrospective study. The group followed it up by doing a prospective study, and again found similar results. So here they had 88 patients with inflammatory bowel disease who were advised to commence a low FODMAP diet. And if you look at the symptoms at baseline, 16% were well at baseline, but after a low FODMAP diet, 78% felt much better. And that was again similar data for Crohn's disease and similar data for ulcerative colitis. And what you can see here is that this is the percentage of patients that had symptoms at baseline. So 43% had abdominal pain, but after following a low FODMAP diet, 18% had abdominal pain. And again, you get similar data for bloating and flatulence. So patients are with inflammatory bowel disease taking a low FODMAP diet do feel it is of benefit. But I think we have to be very cautious, and as I've already mentioned, these are just simply observational studies. These are not randomized controlled trials, so you could argue this is all placebo. That's the first point to mention. The second point to mention is that IBD patients are generally quite sick patients. They can be quite malnourished, so therefore putting them onto quite an extreme diet, such as a gluten-free diet or a low FODMAP diet, could be causing more detriment. And then the final point to make is that these diets can also cause dysbiosis. And we know that from today's talks is that there's a relationship between the microbiota, the metabolites and colonic health, either due to indirect effects or direct effects. And by putting these patients onto such extreme diets, we may be inducing more dysbiosis. So I think we have to be careful in this particular group of patients. And this is the data to show that these diets do cause dysbiosis. So these are patients with just irritable bowel syndrome. And if you put these patients on a low FODMAP diet, what you notice is that you will induce dysbiosis. You will have more bad bacteria and you will have less good bacteria. And we do not know the long-term consequences of such diets. And similarly for inflammatory bowel disease, this has been recently published, again you induce similar dysbiosis. And I think that's something to be very much concerned about, particularly because IBD patients are already at a disadvantage, because they already have dysbiosis, and dysbiosis may well be contributing to their condition in the first instance. So here we have just what normal people are like, and here these are IBD patients. So they have dysbiosis. Dysbiosis may be responsible for inflammation. And therefore the converse has been suggested. Maybe we can give IBD patients things such as FODMAPs to reverse dysbiosis and cause some form of normality, which may improve their IBD, and that's also been tried. So this is one of the first studies I found. So this was on patients who've had their colon resected and have got a pouch now. And these were patients with subclinical pouchitis, and this was a double-blind placebo crossover study. So the individuals were either given placebo or inulin, which is a form of FODMAP. And what they noticed is that this led to an increase in butyrate, which has roles in colonic health, lowered pH, decreased Bacteroides fragilis, which has enterotoxic properties, decreased secondary bile acids, and also led to, when they went back and did endoscopies, led to an improvement in endoscopy and histological inflammation. So actually FODMAPs were useful in patients with pouchitis. And then there was a small open label study from the King's College group. So again, they took patients with Crohn's disease, and these patients were given fructooligosaccharides, so again, belonging to the FODMAP group. And then there was an improvement in their Harvey-Bragg-Joe index, so they had an improvement after going on to after taking the fructooligosaccharides. There was an increase in interleukin 10, which is an anti-inflammatory marker, and there was also an increase in bifidobacteria after going on to a FOS diet. So maybe FODMAPs are actually good for IBD patients. But this was a small open label study, and it was not a randomized controlled trial. And this group has subsequently gone on to do a double-blind placebo-controlled trial with a large sample size, and found that actually there's no difference between placebo and fructooligosaccharides. So this was a negative study. So what we have is, we have two positive studies, which were, one was double-blind, one was an open-label study, and we have one negative study. So the data is very conflicting. So I think I'm going to conclude with this final slide to firstly say that there is some interesting data out there that a gluten-free diet is being utilised by IBD patients, and a low FODMAP diet is being utilised by IBD patients, and it does lead to some symptom improvement. However, we have to be very careful with the data that we have so far, because this is just observational data. These are not randomized controlled trials, so it could be placebo. And that's what we need. We need randomized controlled trials. The other thing to be aware of, would I recommend it into my practice currently? I'd be apprehensive because of these reasons, but also these IBD patients are genuinely sick individuals, and we may be inducing more dysbiosis. And yeah, they may feel better in the short term, but what about the long-term consequences? So I think there's more work to be done. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you very much, Imran. Any questions for Imran from the audience?
Some of the evidence that has come out of the FODMAP research was showing that a lot of their research has been done in patients with ileostomies, and it had reduced their stoma output. But again, it's a case of would that have the same effect if somebody that doesn't have a stoma? Would that have an effect on their colonic bacteria? Is there much research into that?
I don't think there's been much further work done with the ileostomies, but the reason why it does lead to reduced output is because by going into a low FODMAP diet, you're reducing short-chain fatty acids, and therefore you're drawing less water into the lumen. So that's the principle behind it. But I don't think there's been follow-up studies looking at dysbiosis.
Do you have any patient on special carbohydrate diet? Because a lot of people now coming in America, it seems they're using a lot of special carbohydrate diet for Crohn's disease patients, and I just wonder what's your view?
So I don't know what a special carbohydrate diet is.
It's more restrictive than FODMAP.
Sorry?
It's more restrictive than FODMAP. It's no carbohydrate, hardly any carbohydrates at all.
Okay. No, I don't. No, I personally do not have experience with that. I think again, I would be hesitant doing such dietary interventions in IBD patients, given that they already have dysbiosis, and you may be making things worse. I think it's one kettle of fish talking about IBS and healthy controls, but I think IBD, we may be just pushing things a bit too far at this moment in time.
Thank you very much, Imran. Okay, so